That is the worst card in the deck for him.
Joe goes all in.
Hey everyone, so there was a pretty crazy hand on the World Poker Tour a few days ago. It occurred at Thunder Valley at the WPT Rolling Thunder event at the final table. And there's a lot of talk about this hand across social media and in the poker world. In the actual hand, as you saw, it was folded around to Ian, who raised to 160,000 or a little bit less than 3 big blinds. I generally don't like raising less than 3 big blinds, specifically from the small blind into the big blind. If you're going to make that raise, go ahead and make it 3 big blinds and stick with a certain raise size that's consistent no matter what hand you hold. So don't make it 2.7 big blinds if you have kings and 3 big blinds if you have ace-10 or something like that. Ian chose to make it 160 and Joe chose to call. I think this call by Joe is okay, given that he should probably be utilizing a polarized 3-betting strategy at this point in the final table. So he should be re-raising with some very premium hands as well as some pure bluffs, and often calling with some medium strength hands. Part of that is because he's getting decent pot odds out of the big blind to call. And a bigger part of that are the stack sizes and the ICM implications for Joe here. The flop comes ace-5-7 with 2 hearts. Nobody in this hand has a heart. And Ian leads out with a continuation bet for 150,000, or about 40% of the pot. As a default here, continuation betting by Ian into Joe is going to be profitable overall with Ian's entire hand range. And Joe chooses to call the 150,000 and sees the turn of the Jack of clubs. Now this flop call by Joe is, in my opinion, pretty bad. So when you call here in position, you're just floating and you're attempting to take the pot away on future streets, which is a play that absolutely should be in your arsenal overall, but this is not the right spot to be executing it. You have no backdoor draws really, except for the backdoor straight draw. So you don't have a flush draw at all. And most importantly, you're playing against the one player at the table that can bust you. So you're getting involved in this spot where Ian is pretty likely, or should be pretty likely, to be playing aggressively against you for ICM reasons, forcing you to fold on future streets. So this is, I think, a very unprofitable flop call by Joe. Now you could make an argument if Joe had the Queen of Hearts in his hand, that this would be a profitable float. I would have much less of a problem with it. But with no heart here, I think this is just a fold on the flop. And Ian checks to Joe. And Joe bets a little bit more than half pot. I think the turn is played correctly by both Ian and Joe. Ian should be checking here and slowing down. And Joe has to bluff on this turn if he's calling the flop. The whole point of calling on the flop as a float is that you want to take the pot away from your opponent on the turn. And this is one of the best turn cards in the deck for Joe. He turned a Broadway gutshot straight draw, which when you call with just queen high on an ace-high board on the flop, this is one of the better turn cards that you could get. Also, a heart would be a good turn card to bluff on, but this jack is absolutely a card that Joe should be firing on. So I think this is a good bet by Joe here. And since hand ranges are pretty wide overall, and Ian has to call here with his 2 kings, Joe could easily have a heart flush draw or a worse 1-pair hand. So they see the river of the king of clubs. And just to be clear, when Ian does river this set, his primary concern is to extract value here. Joe's hand range is really wide. It doesn't just include queen 10, it includes mostly many other hands that pocket kings here or setup kings beats. And so Ian should be concerned primarily with getting the most value out of this hand. So what's the best way to do that? Well, taking a look at this board, a big portion of Joe's range that he could end up here with would be missed draws. Any 2 hearts would often play the hand this way overall by Joe. So there's going to be a lot of missed draws in Joe's range here. And if Ian bets on this river, Joe's just going to fold those draws. Also, the overall storyline that Ian would be telling if he does choose to bet is a pretty specific one and a little bit strange one for this hand. If Ian check calls this turn and leads on this river, he's saying the king of clubs helped me, which it did in this case. So what does that hand range look like for Ian when he bets out on this river? Well, it's going to be mostly two-pair king X hands. Hands like king jack, occasionally ace king, even hands like king 7 or king 5 could potentially play the hand this way. And so if Ian chooses to lead on the river in this spot, he's effectively saying, hey, I have two pair, which makes it much less likely for him to get value from both the missed draws as well as any one pair hands in Joe's range. So I think checking is by far the superior play here from Ian. However, Ian chooses to lead out for a little bit more than half the pot, 800,000 chips. Joe with the nuts now, of course, on the river moves all in for just under 3 million, and it costs Ian just over 2.1 million to call. And this is where things get pretty strange on the river. Most players in Ian's shoes would call pretty quickly in this spot. We said already that Ian's range when he leads here on the river is heavily skewed by king X two pair hands. Well, if that's the case, if Ian's hand range is often two pair, then Joe should often be shoving hands like a set of 7s or a set of 5s for value against Ian's hand range. And taking a look at the pot odds, if Ian calls, there's going to be 7.29 million in the pot, costs him 2.14 to call. From a chip EV standpoint, that means he needs to win this pot more than 29% of the time to show a profit. If you consider the opportunity cost of those chips, though, it's probably more like a third of the time, maybe 35% of the time. He needs to have the best hand to show a profit here. Given that Joe could easily have a set of 5s or a set of 7s, and he shouldn't have queen 10 very often, that makes this a pretty clear call. Joe should really only have queen 10 here pretty rarely when he has the queen of hearts, so that would be 4 combinations of queen 10 that he should or often should show up on the river here with. He should also often have those set of 5s or set of 7s. That's 6 more combos right there. That means that already 60% of his hand range we're beating. You only need to win about 33 or 35% of the time to show profit with a call here. And we think just with those first few combos we're looking at that we're already winning 60% of the time. So there must be some very specific reason for you to ever fold in this spot. And again, the fundamental problem with Ian's line here is that when he leads, he's representing two pair. And so he can't fold to an all-in when he has a hand that's so much better than what he represented. That's the primary problem with taking this line of bet folding the river, is he's representing a much weaker hand than he actually has. So is there any justification for a fold on this river? Well, we can talk about one strategic justification as well as one kind of metagame justification. The first is that from a strategic standpoint, given these stack sizes, Joe really shouldn't be shoving this river that often. And we said he should be doing it with a set of 5s or a set of 7s, but a lot of players might not even shove those hands here. I think Joe probably would, but a lot of players wouldn't, and it has to do with stack sizes again. If Joe calls on this river and loses with a hand like a lower set, he's still going to be in a very comfortable spot, second in chips at this final table. Whereas if he shoves and loses, of course he's out of the tournament, which is pretty much a disaster for him given that both Ping and David have less than 20 big blinds. Also, Joe can shove here, Ian can call him, and Ian will still be left with second place chip stack even if he loses the hand. So that means that Joe's ability to exert ICM pressure on Ian is rather limited at this point. All that taken together means that Joe probably shouldn't be shoving this river very often. And so, of course, in the moment, Ian does actually fold his set of kings, and people immediately start talking about this hand all over the internet.